Happy anniversary!
Look at the big muscles.
It's bigger.
I need no identities. I'm Bert. Me.
In the bustling city of New York, Dan, a car salesman, has a knack for noticing the small things that others often overlook. This unique ability has earned him the title of Salesman of the Month repeatedly. He enjoys his simple life and looks forward to celebrating his anniversary with his wife, Jessica. They have 3 children, Nia, Kyle, and Max. Nia and Kyle often argue, causing stress within the family. Dan is annoyed with Kyle's constant video gaming and encourages him to spend more time outdoors. Nat, on the other hand, wants to change her college major because of her boyfriend, which worries Dan. Despite his attempts to advise his children, they don't listen. Kyle continues to play video games at a friend's house secretly, and Nat believes she's old enough to make her own decisions. Dan and Jessica have a tradition of going to a carnival every year. However, Jessica craves more excitement in their lives. After an exhilarating roller coaster ride, Dan promises to make their outings more unpredictable. During a sweet moment at the carnival, when Dan and Jessica share a kiss, someone takes a picture of them without their permission. The person posts the photo online and starts bothering Dan. Things escalate when the person spills a drink on Dan and insults Jessica. Despite the provocation and disrespect, Dan chooses to walk away as he despises violence. Jessica tells him that she didn't want him to fight, but internally, she's disappointed in her husband. At home, Dan feels as if he has to hold back, and the confrontation doesn't leave his mind. Jessica finds an outlet in boxing where an accidental punch to her sparring partner leads to an unexpected friendship over smoothies. She opens up to her new friend, Gwen, who is also a travel agent. Jessica shares her feelings of being trapped. She appreciates Dan's qualities as a husband and father, but is frustrated by his contentment with their life as it is. While out shopping with Max, Dan's attention is drawn to a suspicious man seemingly watching him. Acting cautiously, Dan quickly reacts when the man makes a move to attack. Even with Max with him, Dan skillfully manages to fend off the attacker's advances, neutralizing him with ease. The locals are surprised, and even his neighbors notice something different about Dan. At home, Dan opens up a secret compartment containing guns, outdated passports, and cash. Alarmed, Dan contacts Augie, the former associate, to arrange new identities for his family, indicating they're in danger. Augie suspects the threat comes from Dan's old boss, McCaffrey, and advises Dan to disappear as soon as possible. It turns out Dan is an ex-assassin. He has kept it a secret from his family. Most likely, McCaffrey discovered him because of the picture at the carnival. Dan seeks out Nat at an editorial meeting, only to discover she quit 3 months ago. After a small incentive, her friend sells her out. He finds down to the bleachers, upset that she abandoned her dream. But there's no time to dwell on this as they need to collect her brother from the chess club. However, Dan is disappointed to discover him at their neighbor's house, together with his gaming setup. Cautious, Dan tells his kids that they are going to Vegas. In the middle of Jessica's work, Dan persuades her to go on a spontaneous trip she so much desired. Despite her early reservations, she becomes excited and decides to go. But as they are about to leave the parking lot, McCaffrey's men are already waiting. As the bus passes through, Dan skillfully evades the pursuers. A moment later, they catch up to Dan, but he still manages to maneuver around without his family suspecting a thing. It's pretty hard to get away when you're being tracked by a satellite. Dan arrives into his workplace and closes the gates on the pursuers. He then lifts the car up and finds the tracker. He hides just in time for the pursuers to miss him in his car. The family still has no idea. Dan sticks the tracker on his colleague's car and tells him to give that car a spin on the highway. The pursuers take the bait. With 33 hours to go, his wife and kids are tweeting and posting about their trip. To remain anonymous, Dan seizes everyone's phones. It's a device-free trip. The only problem is that they don't know the way to get there. At the travel agency, after another little incentive, the clerk finds them maps for their road. Their family is actually bonding for the first time in a long time. Meanwhile, McCaffrey personally sees Dan's house and is sure his family is still in the dark. One of them will slip up at some point. At the same time, while talking with his sister, a stranger recognizes Kyle from his streaming career and asks for a picture. Dan sees Kyle and the girl taking selfies and knows that McCaffrey will be on his tail soon. So he decides to continue driving to avoid being found. McCaffrey hired more men to track Dan, and he notices 3 of them briefly. His family is asleep, and he turns on music on all of their headphones while preparing to use lethal force. His mirror is shot, but he manages to get rid of one, barely managing to avoid a crash and bumping into one of them. His family is still asleep. Honestly, his family is one of the heaviest sleepers I've seen in my life. The third guy just goes flying. After driving all night, Dan finally closes his eyes, but his family is awake. Half a mile away from the college Nat wants to attend, she argues her way into seeing it. It's a gorgeous place with a lot of festivities. Jessica even shows off her keg stand skills. Even Nat finds that kick-ass. The big part of why they wanted to see the campus is because of her boyfriend, Trevor, attending this college. On a campus tour, Dan spots a German man on his phone and suspects he might be an operative for McCaffrey. However, Dan realizes his mistake when he is unexpectedly attacked by a different individual. They start to fight in the chemistry lab, and after a short scuffle, Dan incapacitates the assailant, rejoining his family shortly after to keep moving. But Nat went to see Trevor. She finds him cheating on her. She returns crying, and Dan teaches her a martial arts move that she uses on Trevor, making her feel much better and appreciate her family more. Back on the road, the family bonds even more, and as Nat's driving, she thanks Dan for always being there for her and thinks of getting back her editorial position at school. At a small motel, parents finally let off some steam. Jessica is in love with the spontaneous Dan. She feels that something is different about him. Dan calls up Augie, who is on his way to deliver the new identities to Dan and his family. The only problem is that he hasn't told them yet. He then sneakily returns the phone he stole and tries to prepare himself for the conversation. Kyle joins him, and they finally talk about him being a streamer. It's something he's good at, like pro-level good. He wants to prove it over laser tag with Dan. They bet on it, first to 3 kills. This should be a breeze for Dan being an ex-assassin and all. He gets the first tag and the second, then Kyle retaliates with 2 of his own, but Dan gets the last one. Kyle feels conned, but the 2 grow closer. Finally arriving in Las Vegas, they are staying at one of the top suites in the city. But first, Dan has to run downstairs. He meets with Augie, who hands him their new identities and a one-way flight to Vancouver for a hefty payout, of course. Dan prepares himself as he plans to tell Jessica the truth over a romantic dinner while the kids babysit Max. Dan tells them not to leave the suite under any circumstance. Not like they will listen. McCaffrey's men are already aware of Dan's location, being a popular gamer. Kyle visits the HyperX gaming arena where he is recognized and even gets to meet Valkyrie. She is so impressed with him that she invites him to join her team for the Valorant finals. However, McCaffrey's men are on their trail. Meanwhile, Nat, another gamer, gives up his spot to Kyle. Kyle proves to be a formidable player, single-handedly decimating the enemy team. In the midst of this, Dan tries to reveal the truth to Jessica, but he is constantly interrupted. He decides to postpone the revelation and instead takes Jessica gambling. After a while, he tries to check on the kids, but his call goes unanswered. They rush back home, only to find dummies in the kids' beds, fooling Jessica into thinking they are asleep. This sets Dan's mind at ease. Jessica decides to freshen up and sets a romantic mood with music. However, this is when McCaffrey's men strike. Dan manages to neutralize them by throwing vodka and setting it on fire. But Jessica is taken hostage. Dan surrenders his gun but discreetly grabs a knife. When one of the assailants calls Dan by his real name, Sean, Jessica is hit with a painful realization. While the assailant is distracted, Dan neutralizes him. Jessica rushes to the kids' room, only to find the dummies. She realizes they must be at the HyperX arena since that's all Kyle has been talking about. Despite his lackluster gameplay, Kyle manages to finish the game with 30 kills. Just as the game ends, their parents arrive to pick them up. Dan finally reveals his secret. He is a covert assassin, and his ex-colleagues are after him. The kids don't believe him until they are shot at and have to take cover behind a car. Dan neutralizes the shooter, but her vest keeps her alive. Dan finally comes clean about his past as McCaffrey's mercenary and confesses to having killed 42 people. Kyle accuses Dan of being a hypocrite. They now understand why Dan never wanted to leave the city and why he is so against social media. He gives them new identities. Na is now Molly and Kyle is Van. After 18 years of lies, the family refuses to accept him. Jessica decides to leave him and take responsibility for the kids. She calls Gwen for help while Dan is left to guard outside. Despite Dan's warnings that it's not safe and that McCaffrey will come after them, Jessica tells him to make it safe and stay away from them. When Jessica arrives, she finds out that Gwen is a powerful woman. Gwen talks about her ex who made new life with an insufferable woman. She befriended the woman and waited for her to walk into her trap. Jessica realizes she has been conned. McCaffrey is here. McCaffrey calls Dan, showing him that his family is in his captivity. He arranges a meeting in an abandoned hotel. McCaffrey's henchmen are everywhere. Upon arriving at the penthouse, McCaffrey asks for a sarcastic hug. It turns out he is Dan's father. McCaffrey wanted Dan dead because he abandoned him, but for the past few days, Dan has been eliminating every man McCaffrey sent after him. His father wants him back. If Dan agrees to work for him, he will let his family go. If he refuses, his family dies. With no other option, Dan agrees to do it. Suddenly, the kids' morals kick in. They want Jessica to protect Dan, even though they wanted to cut ties with him a moment ago. Kyle childishly pushes elevator buttons. While the kids try to persuade their mother that they can't abandon Dan, Jessica changes Max's diaper and stuffs it in the bad guy's face, throwing him off to his death. They decide to go to save their father, Dan, from the clutches of McCaffrey. Meanwhile, McCaffrey is busy making arrangements of his own. Gwen, using her feminine wiles, tries to lure Dan back into her arms, ignoring the tech guy. She's well aware of Dan's tactics and is prepared for what's to come. The family arrives just in time to rescue Dan, who manages to put Gwen to sleep. The tech guy is taken captive in the process. Dan takes this moment to apologize to Jessica for keeping secrets from her. He promises to always tell her the truth from now on. He expresses his desire to be a good husband to her and a loving father to their children. Meanwhile, McCaffrey notices something amiss when he realizes that the tech guy is a fan of Kyle. Kyle, showing off his tech-savvy skills, operates a drone with ease. Dan, demonstrating his technological prowess, instructs his family to head to the roof while he deals with the incoming henchmen. Kyle, acting as Dan's eyes and ears, uses the drone to spot McCaffrey's men and relays the information to Dan. Despite being outnumbered, Dan skillfully takes down the henchmen one by one. McCaffrey, noticing the drone aiding Dan, wakes Gwen up to find the family. Dan pleads with his father to call off his men, but McCaffrey refuses to listen. Even with 10 guys shooting automatic rifles, none manage to hit Dan. As the elevator ascends, Jessica hides the kids and fires at the arriving elevator, only to find Gwen calmly standing on the left. Gwen taunts Jessica, knowing she has the upper hand in hand-to-hand combat. Kyle informs Dan that there are 9 guys left. Dan, undeterred, continues to knock them down one by one. McCaffrey, proud of his sin skills, finally shoots down the drone. Meanwhile, Gwen and Jessica engage in a prolonged cat fight, with Gwen emerging victorious and leaving Jessica buried under a pile of rubble. McCaffrey knocks Dan down and has a clear shot at him, but he can't resist gloating about how Dan's family has made him weak. Gwen corners the kids, giving Jessica the strength to lift the debris. However, Jessica is still tossed around like a rag doll. Dan manages to remove the bullets from McCaffrey's gun, leading to a stick-to-hand combat. Jessica, gathering her inner strength, picks up a bamboo stick and attempts an athletic jump, but fails miserably. Gwen finds this amusing. When Jessica tries again, she manages to land a hit. McCaffrey beats Dan in a fight and grabs a gun to finish him off. Just then, the family comes in, and Nat tells Dan they still care about him. This gives Dan a chance to act. The family reunites, and the police arrive shortly after. 6 months later, Nat becomes a famous journalist. Dan starts a company teaching self-defense and hires Augie. Jessica becomes a coach, and Kyle continues to make videos online. The family prepares for a big trip, packing up an RV to take Nat to Stanford. As the story concludes, the audience is thanked for watching and encouraged to subscribe for more content.